I'm Kathy Minahan. I'm the president of the NACD New England chapter, and I'm really grateful to all of you for joining us, for some of you early, on our virtual program, Disruptive Technologies, Friend or Foe. I'm really interested in how we're all thinking about the intersection of things like AI with enterprise risk management and strategy at the board level. And our four speakers this morning I know are going to tackle that complicated topic. I know all the boards I sit on are wrestling with this, how to oversee and still benefit from disruptive technologies. Before we get started, we have a couple of housekeeping items. First, a reminder to remain muted through the program and to use the chat function to pose questions. You don't have to wait until the Q&A portion. We'll monitor the chat box during the panel discussion and intersperse questions as they come up. Next, we know that many of you want to receive credits, NACD credits for this program. To receive credit, we need to know your first and last name. So be sure that your full name is visible on your Zoom window. And if you're attending using your phone, please email Larissa Rivetto so that you can receive credit for this program. Finally, the panelists and moderators' statements and opinions are totally their own and not the companies for which they work. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't thank all of our chapter sponsors. And Larissa, do we have our slide on that? Here they are. The continued loyalty of these organizations underscores the important role of NACD. It's their support that allows us to fulfill our mission of delivering world-class, director-centric, local programming, and peer-to-peer sharing of insights that's vital to advancing excellence in the boardroom. Today, we're highlighting two very special spotlight sponsors, Lockton and RSM. Both of these organizations have continued to support our mission of excellent corporate governance. Thank you so much for your support. And now to the really easy part of my job this morning. It's my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Darren Donovan. Darren's a board director and a retiring managing partner at KPMG. I'll now turn it over to Darren. Good morning.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Kathy. Good morning. It's my pleasure to be here. And I'll start off by introducing our speakers, which I'm very excited to do today. We have a great panel for you today. First, let me introduce briefly and get to know these folks if you can. They have extraordinary backgrounds. I won't do it justice this morning, covering just some highlights. But again, very, very happy to start. Bert Scott is an experienced public company director since 2003. Currently, Bert sits on the boards of the Lowe's Company, Becton Dickinson, and Dollar Tree. Sophie Vandebroek is a director at IDEX Laboratories, Wolters Kohler, Revity, and Ingra Agriculture. Chris Vanuga is a principal of Risk and Advisory at Deloitte and part of the Strategic Risk Services offering portfolio within Deloitte's Risk and Financial Advisory Group. So thank you all for being here today. We really appreciate the time you're giving us. So today's program, as you see from the title, we try to make it really interesting for you, friend or foe, right, to get your attention. But this is about understanding how boards should think about disruptive technologies and how, more importantly, to incorporate them as an opportunity or a threat. Into our discussions around enterprise risk management and strategy, you'll get some real insights from our esteemed panel today. So let's kick it off. Let's start with, what is disruptive technology and how do we define it? Chris, I'd like to turn it over to you to start.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and good morning, everyone, and good afternoon for those who are calling in from over the sea. Thanks for having me here to be part of this terrific group and the conversation. Well, first, let me start off by saying, let's just start with the classic definition. I think everyone's well aware, just when they think about disruption in general and technology, we've all experienced a fair amount of that in our lifetimes. But I think where we're at today is a very more interesting time. Let's leave it at that. We'll talk more about that. I mean, classically, whenever you've had any significant or abrupt change from the introduction of technology, or I think this is important for today's discussion, the advancement of technology. I know that's one of the things that some of these technologies, and we'll talk more, and Sophie is going to go into a lot of this in a moment, I believe. But some of these technologies aren't novel. They've been around for quite some time. But I think what's really interesting is what's happening in the application of these technologies. And I think that's where some of the heightened excitement, positively, the optimist, and those who are concerned, some of the maybe pessimists in that. Whenever we talk about disruption, we really have to think about a couple of factors. What's the impact, the type of innovation it's going to allow or potentially threaten you, back to the point of this conversation. The issue of acceleration is a very important point we'll get to as well. The velocity at which some of these changes are happening are phenomenal. I know Sophie probably and others will talk about that, but when you think about the uptake on ChatGPT, how quickly did it get to 100 million users? It's unbelievable in the history of technology. That is the fastest uptake we've had. When you think about just where all that's going to go, that really starts to add more questions than answers. I think everyone knows, and I won't spend more time on this. I was going back and reminding myself of like, well, what are some of the more major disruptions where we would think, well, that's something we have to be kind of focused on. And I think about digital photography. Everyone knows the unfortunate, well-known Kodak versus, say, Sony, how that happened there. We think about digital media. We think about the classic one, right? Blockbuster versus Netflix. And it goes on. And even today, the more recent one, when you think about what Uber, Lyft, and what that did to a very long-running sector called taxis, right? So again, I know rather simple maybe compared to some of the technical capabilities we have today, but I think that's something that's we all kind of have to look back and say, okay, what is the analog to today? But lastly, I want to bring up one other thing. This is very recent that I thought that was something that's even, I'll just say it's more interesting and adds to this issue of the velocity, uptake, and potential impact, right? The key characteristics of what's a technology disruption. It was a book that came out recently, Mustafa Salman. I don't know if any of you read that yet, The Coming Wave. It really is. Again, this is not an endorsement one way or the other. And I think there's some interesting balance in his discussion. Founder of DeepMind, was with Google for a while, now Inflection AI. Some of you may know or have spent some time with him, Sophie's shaking her head. But it's pretty amazing when you think about what he put through there, the idea that this maybe we're on the cusp of another general purpose technology. And that's an interesting concept that I think we can talk a bit about here, which is, I think they say in the study, the history of man, we've only had about 24 or so general purpose technologies in our history of civilization. Electricity, the printing press, language even. And then if you go to even computers, the internet, of course, and what that did. And then here we are with AI and synthetic biology. So when you start to put this all together, are we in fact at this sort of wave of a technology? It's not one technology, but a collection of technologies. And then the last point I'd kind of make in this, Darren, and would be the fact that it's not just the one technology, it's the technology and what it enables. And in my initial comment, I talked about it's not the technology, but the application. Guys been around for a long time, but we're now finally starting to reap some amazing insights from that technology. What could these together, when you start looking at quantum and these other technologies and you bundle them together, like we're doing in some of the research around the genome and all, it's unbelievable what the potential impact could be. So with that, I think it's a lot for us to talk about, and very excited about the conversation. Darren?
Yeah, Chris, thanks a lot. I think a lot of the insights that you gave, you talked about the velocity, right? And now like sort of the exponential part of this and how these innovations can impact consumers, industries, and business, how they operate all at the same time. So, I think you point out there's a large number of these existing technologies that can be considered disruptive. Sophie, can you take us take a few minutes and set up the landscape for the audience so they understand how broad the world is today?
Okay, thanks, Darren, and thanks, Chris. A very good definition and introduction to disruptive technologies, and they will lead to disruptive business models, and that's why we are here today, because if you're not prepared, it will lead to commoditization of your business. So just like the title of the book, I compare disruptive technologies to huge waves that are coming at us. And you can either successfully surf this wave or be swept away by it. And Chris gave some examples of companies that are truly have been swept away. So being in the boardroom, thinking about how can my company be successful as these waves come at us. But luckily, there are always ripples that you see much, much earlier than the big wave. Like ChatGPT today is just such a ripple. And so in addition, you can have your small boats to go explore the horizon. And as Chris also mentioned, these technologies don't happen overnight. ChatGPT didn't happen overnight. It was, in fact, decades in the making. But in the short time I have, I will touch on a dozen examples of disruptive technologies. And for those of you who will get credits, there will not be an exam at the end. But some of those, you definitely, depending on the industry and your market, you have to talk about them in the boardroom. And I will keep AI for last, because that is already a topic in all boardrooms, but I do want to touch on that last. But number one is cloud computing. And cloud computing, as we all know, have enabled businesses to store, process, access data in a truly on-demand way. Most services now, or a lot of them, are pay for data, you pay as you go. And so that required many companies, that of course has an impact on revenue and profits as if you sell these services. So many companies had to make this transition in a careful way. But for most companies, this one is behind us, such as for IDEX Laboratories or Wolters Kluwer, two of the companies where I'm on the board of. So that brings me to number two, which is edge computing. You may think, but you just said cloud computing. So now we go back to the edge, and indeed, the answer is yes. And especially in the age of AI, bringing compute power and data processing to where the data is generated is the way to go. In fact, I think it's almost 3/4 of AI inferencing, it's processing, it's using the trained algorithm to look up the information and extract insights. Today is happening at the edge. Think, for example, Face ID. I mean, all of that just happens at the edge, and that enables real-time decision-making. For example, for smart cars, there is no time for the data to go to the cloud and back, because the crash would have long happened if that was the case. And the edge is also more private and secure. Think hospital settings or financial institutions or wearable devices. Today, a lot of this still goes to the cloud, but there is gonna be more and more of this processing will happen at the edge. And in fact, in IDEX, all the diagnostic equipment sold to veterinaries today are edge devices, where a lot of the processing is happening at the edge, and then the insights or the diagnostics are uploaded to the cloud, such that the vet and the pet owner can see the results on their laptop or iPhone or wherever you want to look at that. So if you have the cloud and the edge, I come to number three, which is the next generation of networks, and especially wire networks that are connecting these edges with the cloud and creating this truly Internet of Things systems. And there's a lot of work happening. I mean, 5G has been rolled out. 6G will enable even faster data transfers, lower latencies, etc., lower power usage, which obviously it's super important. And again, this whole connected Internet of Things world is also not new. I mean, the ripples were here 20 years ago. This term was even coined. And so now number four, two specific edge capabilities are augmented reality and virtual reality. Again, two technologies that have been in the labs for many, many years, but now there are many applications in industry, from retail to entertainment to manufacturing and to healthcare. Let me give you one example. Wolters Kluwer launched in 2023 an immersive virtual reality tool to train nurses in real-time medical emergency in hospital settings, so they can go in and treat an emergency or a non-emergency and be trained that way instead of always having to have real hospital settings. So again, think about for your company, what does VR or augmented reality mean? Linking to the next emerging technology, again, emerging in the makes for a long time, is robotics. And today it's already used in many companies, companies that have large warehouses or manufacturing plants. But now with AI embedded within those robots, the robots will be definitely much better, especially with these generative AI models, better to read, to speak, to hear, and to perform tasks much faster and more accurately. So how do the companies we're on the board of, can they benefit from robotics? That leads me to 3D printing. I worked at Xerox a while back for over 25 years. And even when I was first hired, we were already working on 3D printing. So it's been in the make for a half century. And it continues to emerge. But if it truly emerges, it has the potential to really realize this vision of truly personalized manufacturing. Think you go to the dentist and your dental brace is printed while you wait. Today, it's still a niche market, but there are many other applications, and especially as companies are continuing to work to make this technology faster and more affordable, there are potentially many opportunities. So now switching industries, and in fact, 3D printing is already also used in the life sciences industry, but there is gene editing, and Chris briefly touched on that, and especially in food and life sciences. So if your company operates in the health or animal healthcare or in crop or livestock agriculture, advancements in gene editing like CRISPR, you really have to understand them. And this, in many companies, should be a board discussions. They should stay informed about the ethical considerations, IP, regulatory landscape. Inari Agriculture is a company I'm on the board of, and they use CRISPR to edit seeds, corn, wheat, soy. And in fact, that is accelerating exponentially the conventional breeding. So there is not foreign genes introduced, but you accelerate how fast you can get to seeds that are much more climate resistant, for example, or higher yield. And of course, there's a whole AI front end to this. Quickly switching back to software, let me mention blockchain. Blockchain or distributed ledgers have broad applications in areas such as supply chain management, identity verification, trusted data sharing, etc. And again, blockchain is not new. IBM created a blockchain business a decade ago. Early partners, and I worked at IBM for a little bit, early partners collaborated to track the workflow required for global shipping. Financial institutions are able to share the KYC or know your customer information in a very trusted way. And individuals can track the diamond on, I don't have one here, but diamond on your finger to the mine and verify that the diamond trade indeed comply, for example, to the Kimberley regulations if you put AI or just analytics on top of the blockchain. But of course, I can't mention blockchain without touching on cryptocurrencies, which is separate. They are, I believe, not important to most companies. However, if you are in financial services, do keep an eye on it. As you might know, BlackRock recently created a Bitcoin EFT and is planning to also create an Ether one. And this is mostly due to the persistent client demand, but I do remain skeptical there. Number 10, and Chris touched on it briefly, is quantum computing. This emerging technology has been in the making for a century. It uses specialized hardware, qubits that really mimic quantum mechanics. And so that makes then that these computers can solve problems very fast that classical supercomputers are just not able to solve today. And the commercialization is being commercialized. It's in early stages. IBM, for example, has 12 quantum computers installed around the world. They're accessible in the cloud. They have about 1,000 qubits. And it's expected that when they have several thousands of qubits, they will break existing encryption technologies. So it's like a year 2000 moment. all companies will have to update their security encryption. And luckily, in parallel, companies are working on developing new encryption technologies that won't be broken by quantum. But this is an issue for companies, government, of course, and also individuals. That leads me to number 11. I'm almost there. Cybersecurity. It's a chicken and an egg game in cybersecurity. It's always been, but today it's just so much faster. Hackers will increasingly use sophisticated technologies such as AI to get into your company. Social engineering will become way more sophisticated. Nothing we will see, hear, or read can be trusted anymore because deepfakes, as we all know, can easily be created with AI. This is a big problem. Not only for our companies, but for society at large. And then finally, I would be amazed if I don't briefly mention that there are also many cost-effective, disruptive, sustainable, and renewable technologies that are emerging with a growing concern about climate change. I know this is already a topic, and the regulations, this is already a topic in all boardrooms. So this is a dozen of technologies. I can, Darren, if I have a few more minutes, go into AI specifically, but
no, I think, thank you. Very comprehensive presentation and landscape. Well done. And I think it would be great, given the large number of the disruptive technologies, why don't we focus a little on generative AI, since it really is generating a lot of conversation. I'd say to our guests today, think of all these examples that Sophie's given us really just as proxies for how we should consider all disruptive technologies from the board perspective. And later we'll be coming back to you with some key learnings and key takeaways later. So Sophie, maybe talk about generative AI, if you would.
Yeah, especially since we're going to use generative AI as example in the future discussion in our panel. We're going to focus on that. But the first time I used ChatGPT in November 2022, it really felt like magic, right? Suddenly, for the first time in history, you have a technology that speaks our language, understands, writes code, draw images, writes poetry, entirely novel, can create entirely new output. It really both inspires, surprises, delights us. But again, AI is not magic. It's mathematics, it's science, and it was also not very sudden. All these technologies, including AI, have been decades in the making. And in fact, ChatGPT or these generative large language models is just a ripple that we see today of the big wave that is coming at us. In fact, it was 1950 when Alan Turing, often called the father of AI, wrote a seminal paper about natural language processing. And then in 1956, at Dartmouth University, the artificial intelligence word was coined. And they had already, most of what we see today was already articulated in their vision of that group of people 70 years ago. So why is AI important now? Why today is this in fact possible and real? It's because of three items. Number one, the algorithms. And again, the algorithms have been worked for a long time, but they continue to evolve from handcrafted algorithms to deep learning neural networks and now the large language models. But the number two is the compute power. Back in the time, there wasn't just compute power to train all these algorithms. Today, there are over 100 billion transistors on a GPU, and banks of interconnected GPUs can provide the compute power to train the AI algorithms. And there has been a dramatic reduction in compute and storage costs. And this is making AI possible today. This is allowing these networks with trillions of nodes to be trained. And of course, it's making NVIDIA, who is the leader in commercializing these GPUs, also very rich today. But while NVIDIA has the lead now, all major technology companies, all the big ones, are investing in their own AI chip. And with the CHIP Act in the US, there is also a lot of money flowing into the next generation AI chips, which will be much faster, much less energy required, etc. And then thirdly, and that's important for all the companies that we're on the boards of, is you cannot talk about AI without data. The models are data hungry. They need to be trained on your data. And with all the business processes now digital, luckily you can have so much more quickly access to the data. But the data is really your crown jewel. Don't outsource it. Make sure it's accessible and you can mine it and you can use it to train these models. So yeah, I can, and if there are questions, I would be happy to go in much more detail about what large language models really are, and how deep learning in 2020 was the first time that companies started to commercialize AI in their products in very narrow areas. For example, IDEX launched in 2015 a veterinary instrument that could, with image recognition, could recognize dozens of particles in the urine of cats and dogs. We called it liquid gold. And it's something that the vet now could do that was never possible before. So it really disrupted how vets can really analyze and predict sicknesses. But that was still a supervised trained network. And now with the large language models, it's unsupervised learning. They're just trained on all of open data on the net. And companies have to take these models. You don't have time and money to create them yourself unless you're one of the big ones, but you take them and you adjust them and train them in your own unique company data. And then you can launch products that way, like Wolters Kluwer's did just last week, announcing a product where they took all their healthcare information data and up to date, used it with the large language models, and now the doctors and nurses have a capability to really ask and have a dialogue about sicknesses and diseases and what to do. So as you can see, there are many ripples way out in front. The key thing to a board is to know when are these ripples so important that we do have to discuss it in the boardroom.
Yeah. Thank you, Sophie. Appreciate that. And I just want to thank Ellen Richstone today, our chair of our program committee. You put on such great things. And Ellen, you're going to help me with questions in the chat today. If you see any really good ones, Ellen, please just jump in. I'd like to turn over to Bert now and talk about it from the board's perspective. Given the key challenges that boards face with such a large number of existing and potentially emerging disruptive technologies, Bert, what are those challenges boards are facing today, please?
Well, after listening to this conversation from Chris and Sophie, I think I'm going to step down from my boards because the speed and innovation. It's the issue of speed of change. It is no longer incremental change. It's the exponential volume of items or technologies, as well as the speed in which they impact your business in a way that you can't anticipate it. Chris, you spoke about IBM or you spoke about Kodak. When I was thinking about this, I was thinking about being in the boardroom of IBM in the introduction of laptops. I was thinking about Kodak at the time of digital innovation in photography, and what were those questions those board members were asking or should have been asking to enable them to anticipate what was going to happen to their business and pivot in a way that would have made them more successful. IBM survived, certainly in a very different way. Kodak did not. I would have liked to have been in the room with Zoom at the beginning of the pandemic, because they couldn't have anticipated the impact of their technology was going to have on the world at a time when they really weren't prepared for it, if you think about it. If you think of how quickly we pivoted to phone calls and in-person meetings to doing everything in a digital environment, I guarantee you they weren't asking the questions that they needed to ask. How quickly do we scale up? How quickly do we buy technology to support what we do? So all of those are great thoughts that I had when I was getting prepared for that. Sophie, you talked about blockchain and machine learning and generative AI. I think one of the first things that happens in the boardroom is let's define what we're talking about. That's the most difficult thing I find, because you have people who come to the board with different experiences and different knowledge, and it's uneven, frankly. You bring a CFO in and they're going to be steeped in the financials of the business. You bring a generalist in, they're going to be steeped in whatever the specifics are. You got a CEO, and the business is changing so rapidly. How do we get every board member to the right level so the conversation is robust enough to really talk about it in a way that we can ask the right questions? If you think about a board, our job is not to run the business every day, but it's to ask the questions properly and to go deep enough to fully understand what it means to the business. How do we as a board look around the corner to anticipate what's the impact going to be on the business and what you're doing. Do we have the right governance model for today? You think about generative AI and the ethical implications of that. Are we prepared to talk about generative AI from an ethical standpoint? It's not the question for me of can we? The question is should we on some of these things? And I think that's a big question that in a boardroom. Is this technology going to disrupt our business? Who does this allow to enter our space that heretofore there were barriers that would not have allowed to enter the space? You know, I think about robotics and, you know, one of the boards I'm on, we manufacture needles. You know, if you invested deeply into the types of technology that produced those needles 25 years ago, you had an advantage. Today with robotics, you've lowered the cost so dramatically that it now makes that commodity in some ways. You can get competition from other places that you would never have thought of before. What are the cost implications of the business? What's the impact to shareholders? You know, as we begin to spend on these new technologies, which one is really going to make the difference for us? It's one thing to protect your turf and make sure competitors, you have to be able to compete against people, but what things should we be investing in to leapfrog our business? Is this a technology that's going to just keep us in place because we just need to do it? It's a kind of an infrastructure change, or is this a leapfrog technology for us? Is this going to just change the business in which we're in? Does this allow us to enter businesses that we heretofore couldn't enter? I mean, all of those are questions that in a boardroom I think we have to ask. But again, I think it starts with the initial learning. I'll give you an example. One of the boards I'm on, we were having a conversation about generative AI. And we asked for a definition. And if you went around the room, there were 7 definitions of what generative AI was, right? Because we use a generic term, AI, right? But what does that really mean? So we had to really sit down and define what we were talking about. And once you define the parameters of what you're talking about, now you can have a more wholesome discussion around what it is. What board education is needed? Who do we need to bring in? Do we need to bring Sophie in and have a very deep conversation with about emerging technology so that we all have the learnings that are important for us to understand what's going on in our business? Again, all of those things are really important. You know, as a board member, you have a short timeline to think about what it is you need to be impacting. You know, do you impact the strategy? Do you impact day-to-day operations? Management has every day to think about that. We as a board have to come prepared from either our readings or taking advantage of programs like this so that when we come into the room, we have a base of understanding so that we can have a robust conversation. I suspect when people walked into the room in Kodak 50 years ago and they started talking about digital technology, no one had any idea what they were talking about. Except maybe the researchers and scientists that work for Kodak that were working on it themselves, right?
They were the best in the world.
They were the best in the world, but how does a board get out of the way of natural inertia? We have a very successful business here. It's going extremely well. We're making lots of money. We're creating shareholder value. If we deploy resources over here and this technology doesn't work, we're going to destroy value potentially. That's a natural inertia that happens in a boardroom and with a management group. How do you have a robust conversation enough, and how do you get enough information into the room so you could really challenge managers thinking about some of these things? I guarantee there was one board member sitting there at Kodak that said, you know, we really should invest in this. This could be pretty cool. But no one can conceptualize how digital photography would actually work. Think about Motorola when they were talking about, Motorola had all the component parts that Apple had to create the phone that we use today. They couldn't come together around making the investment in that technology that would disrupt their own business, frankly, and take that risk because you kind of spend your day worrying about how you're going to get to the next quarterly earnings and how do you make sure you aren't destroying shareholder value. Very difficult conversations.
Yeah.
Very necessary conversations. And having the right, and should you reconfigure your board? Do we have the right people sitting around the table today? The business has changed. What was useful to us 10 years ago may not be useful to us today as a board member. You know, one of my boards just went through a refresh. Fortunately, I survived that refresh. somehow I convinced them I still was relevant in that conversation. But it is that these are the really difficult conversations that board members need to have today, and board leadership needs to force in that conversation. That's how I would speak to that.
Yeah, agree, Bert. I think you've laid the challenges out very well for us. If not head spinning, right, a little bit, but these are the times we're in. And I think this is great. We have a question in the chat, which I'll just kind of summarize, and we'll kind of go into our next thing. I've seen studies that say, most board members rely on management to keep them apprised on emerging technologies and stuff. And one of our directors asked, do we actually carve out a C-suite resource to focus on this and help boards in that? So keep that in mind as we kind of get into our next question, which is right on point. Should the board identify emerging technologies, since many of the new ones now considered disruptive have actually been around for years, to Sophie's point? Are there ways to consider these in our ERM, or enterprise risk management analysis? Chris, you want to start us off and maybe think about that C-suite resource too question?
Sure. Yeah, let's come back to that. Well, first of all, I think it was great to hear Bert say something that I wanted to touch upon here about this question, which is Marshall Goldsmith, the author and a coach, very famous for a couple of his books there. He has a quote that I think is very appropriate during this time that we're in, especially in this context of this question that you just posed and boards, and what got you here won't get you there. And I appreciate that quote in this context, because I think that does summarize quite simply. It doesn't give you the answer, but it does kind of open your mind. And what I thought was great about what Bert said was and it's something that I think that's part of this whole how to tackle this is there isn't an answer key. There isn't an answer book. We're not going to go in the back and look and say, here it is. But I think it's that having that common language. I think, Bert, you talked about, people come in, you ask them what it is, and everyone's got a different opinion. There's some very, unfortunately, I hate to say, very unsophisticated approaches to some of these very sophisticated challenges, which is, let's all get on the same page. What's our language? What's our risk appetite? What's our things? But before I digress, I think this idea of the conventional risk management approaches is probably not suited for purpose today. And I think that what we're seeing out there is that, are you looking at both the upside as well as the downside of risk? I think it's something very, very important. Something that I've seen out there with leading practices is that, whether you call that value creation, not just value preservation or asset preservation. I think that's something that's very important as you're thinking about this, as you're structuring your risk programs. I don't want to be derogatory in my commentary about it, but generally speaking, back on what got you here, it's tended to focus on that downside. What bad could happen? How do we prevent that? How do we inoculate ourselves, to use that appropriate term here with everything going on these days? How do we inoculate ourselves from the downside risk? But I think even, Bert, you may have said this before here, how do we get over this inertia? I think that was a great point here. And I think when we think about risk, the idea is, what is risk? Well, it's loss, it's harm, but it's also missed opportunities, which is also the synonym for that is failure. And if you think about the forensics definition of failure, and that's something, by the way, no one wants to talk about, certain industries in particular. You don't want to talk about failure in healthcare, right? That just, how could you talk about it? But in the business context, it really is important. I think this is where how we might try to get over inertia is the idea of the fact that you set a target or a goal for something and you don't achieve that. So that missed opportunity, the difference between desired outcome and the actual outcome, that's a failure in terms from a business context or even in a governance context. And so the question is, what do we do about that? Have we looked at that? Have we gone back and have we done some of the reviews on that? So I think that there's a lot of great things there. First of all, I think just one or two simple, I think, Darren, your question around what could boards be doing to, more disruptive, and what do they, do more of that? I think, are you doing enough risk sensing? Are you really, and I talked about that role out there. I think this is one opportunity for that type of role. Do you, in fact, we've seen a lot of organizations doing very well, and they've set up their own sort of intelligence team internally that is really focused on, and the number one role is to really gather information. How to become, we talk about intelligence is the ability to take data, take information, process it, and create insights, and then take actions. I mean, if you think about that having that kind of capability internal, it's not one person, by the way. I think it's that capability. And some of the industries that are, you know, even more attuned to risk, financial services, banking, and like, they've done that for many, many years. I just don't know if it's been applied as well in all companies to have that kind of thing. The second thing is, and it kind of mentioned something that Bert said about how do we think about our board composition and what's going on. I was listening the other day to a discussion of some directors, and it was really exciting because they're talking about bringing in guest speakers. Let's bring in more external. By the way, that's not to say that, you know, you have lack of confidence on your management team or anything like that. It's because no one can keep up on this. So instead of having one person on the board or one person on your management team, can we bring in guest speakers and all that? I heard another real fun time, and I think this is great. We're getting us out back in the world. Field trips was an idea that were thrown up. Like, hey, the board needs to go on a field trip, or maybe a committee of the board, or a subgroup of the board. Go visit some of these interesting new technologies. Go and visit those who are using technology, both as a threat and an opportunity. So I think there's some interesting things there. And I think lastly, and Bert, I think you mentioned this as well, which is the idea of, and I think a few of us have talked about this before, how do we, in fact, elevate the digital proficiency of our boards and of the management team? So this idea of digital proficiency that I think, if you think back to my opening comments around this being a general purpose technology, no one understands how electricity works, but you know how to use electricity, you know, the language and things. I think ChatGPT and others will probably get to the point where it becomes, no one asks, did you know how to use, you know, Outlook? Do you know how to use your conference Zoom, right? I think these technologies may get there. So the idea that what is the minimum digital proficiency we need to have versus maybe do we have the right person on our board? Do we need to flip things out? I still think that's not something that you shouldn't look at, but I think that's something that you can do across the board.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, I think certainly you established that board should be doing this and focusing ERM in their analysis. I'm going to ask Sophie and Bert to comment to this question. Since emerging technologies or disruptive technologies can be both positive opportunities as perhaps maybe negative, how can the board understand both sides of that equation, and what should they ask management to include both within the risk evaluations and the strategy discussions? Sophie, will you lead us off?
Yes, I definitely think emerging technologies and understanding their capabilities at least come in for the full board once a year as part of the strategy discussion, right? In all of the companies, and as Bert mentioned earlier, in Kodak, they were working on CMOS CCDs back in the 80s. They were some of the most advanced in the world, except the boardroom didn't have the discussion, most probably. So every company has these little boats that are scanning the horizon. I mean, in Xerox, we had big labs. In IBM, there were 5,000 people around the world scanning the horizon. So how do you bring that in the boardroom? At least on an annual basis in the strategy discussion. And regarding the C-level executive, in all the companies I've been on the board of, it's always a chief technology officer that will lead the discussion. And they look at, okay, what are potentially emerging technologies? And they might discuss a whole bunch of them, similar to how I did very quickly. And then say, but these are the three that we really should discuss in the boardroom. This is how our competitors are using and looking at them today. And this is how it would benefit the customers. So making it part of the strategy discussion is extremely important. Some of the companies also, especially if they're mostly driven by organic growth through R&D inside the company, but also if they do a lot of acquisitions or partnerships, open innovation is important. Have specific technology committees. At IDEX, I have one that I share. And so in the technology committees, you can have a subset of the directors that can really go deep and truly understand what they are, what it means, what the risks are. And then often the audit committee looks at it from a risk point of view. For example, in AI, because we were going to use that as an example, you have to make sure that the models you launch are trusted, right? That they can be trusted by whether it's a physician or it's a financial institution or just in general, the consumers today, right? So for example, a couple of weeks ago, Google stock fell 5% after its large language model called Gemini created historically non-correct founding fathers. I mean, they were trying to do something really good. They were trying to make sure that the data was inclusive, so the generative AI really shows images of many different topics that are inclusive. But nevertheless, this can really impact your brand and your stock. The same with Microsoft Copilot AI. They work with OpenAI. They invested billions of dollars. Their image generator just last week created disturbing images of car accidents. You just asked, throw me an image of a car accident, and that included sexualized women. So the Microsoft engineer wrote to the board, wrote to the FTC, and so this whole thing also blew up. So you have to make sure that as part of the product development process, for example, and that's what we have done in Wolters Kluwer already for 3 years or so, that you, as the products and the services or the expert solutions are being developed, that you do major checks to make sure that the algorithms aren't biased, they are secure because they can be hacked, that it's transparent, because with all these emerging regulations, you need to be able to explain how the algorithms reach the decision or the recommendation. And it goes on and on. I mean, you can create now these frameworks for ethical AI. So it's just important to look at that. And that's all part of the risk management.
Yeah, I agree. You're talking about reputational risk there. How more important is that? Bert, can you comment on that intersection of risk and strategy from the board perspective?
Yeah. I think that's Sophie has really touched on a lot of these things, I think in a very effective way. I think boards have certain responsibilities, right? We have the responsibility to help work with management on setting strategy, understanding and agreeing on how much risk we're willing to take, monitoring that risk, and then always protecting shareholder value to the extent you can do that, right? Hiring a CEO, those are all very important functions of our board. This whole risk element, I'll give you an example. As we think about risk management from an audit perspective, I chair an audit committee. So if I think about risk management from that perspective, is technology innovation or is disruptive technology on your heat map? And how do you define it? What are you talking about? Who's responsible in the organization to look at these disruptive technologies and alert the organization, and then therefore management, and then the board to the inevitable introduction of whatever that disruptive technology is going to be. If you don't include it in your risk discussion, then you're clearly going to, because it is in fact a risk. It's just like cyber security or geopolitical risk. These are all risks to our business, and that's what we should be looking at. The thing that I try to think about, I think about value versus risk. What's the value we're going to get from whatever the technology is? I'm going to use your glass half full, Chris, example. All technology is not bad. All disruptive things are not bad. Some of them are quite good, and we can probably give lots of examples of where technology and disruption has really been good for mankind and for lots of things. But there are times when the value of that introduction of technology doesn't offset the risk associated with whatever that is. However you define that in your company, however you define that as a board, I think you've got to look at both of those elements as you try to do that. I was going to say this earlier, just real quick. It's funny how when you're a CEO or CFO or C-suite person and you join a board, part of the reason it made you successful in those companies is your natural curiosity about whatever business you were in. And somehow we turn that switch off when we get into the boardroom. You can't do that. I mean, so the job of the board has been increasingly difficult day to day, increasingly difficult. So many things to look at, so many responsibilities. But that natural curiosity around your business, whatever board that's on, has got to stay there. Because if it stays there, you're reading the articles about disruptive technology. You're asking the right questions in the boardroom. You're going to be a pain in the butt some days because you're going to be asking questions that management is not ready to answer. But I think that's part of your job as a board member. Just thought I should say that before we step away.
Let me just segue into this question. I'll ask Bert you to start, and Sophie, I'd love to hear your perspectives too. So, how can management and the board understand if they're taking, enough risk that create greater opportunities and use the technology to create the business opportunities to help companies grow, and not just shutting down new approaches to business? What do you think, Bert?
Yeah. So Sophie talked about this a little bit, and I'll just try to amplify it a little bit. So each of these businesses are organized to deliver something of value hopefully to the customers, to the world, et cetera. And so what you're trying to do in that scenario is understand, how do I continue to remain relevant as a business to serve whatever the market you're trying to serve? That by definition means that you have to take some risk. You have to continue to look at innovation to enhance your business. When these disruptive technologies show up, I think your obligation is to figure out how to harness them, to leverage your business forward, to move it forward into a different space, to move up into a category that you weren't able to move into, move laterally into a square that you may have been interested in but not able to do before. And again, I think it's a curiosity and a dialogue that you and management in your strategic sessions have to take your time through. Day to day in regular board meetings, you don't have time to do that every time. You may spotlight something, but the strategy sessions need to then emphasize looking at things in a much more innovative way, not just line extension. A lot of strategy sessions you guys have gone to is talking about, okay, we're doing a line extension over here, we're going to add these things, we're going to add that thing, but it's not particularly strategic nor innovative. Those strategic sessions need to be much more strategic in real strategy and much more focused on innovation. And I think a couple of my boards have really made that shift away from just talking about what is and trying to make the board understand it, to talking about what could be. I guess it's the better way to describe it.
Yeah. Sophie, what do you think?
I hope I answered that question.
Yeah, no, I think it's a tough question. I think it's a great answer. Sophie, anything to add?
Yeah, so I think as directors, we can make a big difference. I think in a couple of my boards, and if that's not happening in your boards, you can suggest it. Before the strategy session, a few months before, there's a little survey to the directors, like, what do you see as the key emerging topics? You can think about it, emerging technologies or potentially emerging business models. But what do you see as a topic that we must include in our strategic discussions this year? And so it's always a meeting that's twice as long. And in fact, that's in most of the boards and the other meetings. And so we, at least I, for the last decade, would always say, I want to see what AI can do for your company, right? So, or you can say, what does blockchain mean? What do robotics mean? And so then they have to address it. And again, I bet you within the company, people are already thinking about it. And it's an opportunity to bring these ripples to the board and then not only ask, what are you doing, or what does it mean from a technology point of view, but what are the competitors doing, or what are the other potential risks associated with it? I mean, one of the key things, if you don't take action, right, that's the biggest risk of all, because then you get commoditized, as a couple of us mentioned earlier. So really, as a director, asking this to be explicitly part of the strategy discussion is important. They will always say, but there's so many things you want to discuss, and then you have to help prioritize. Yeah, no, let's focus on these 3 topics today and not review the product roadmaps of these particular businesses because they're doing well. We don't need to go into detail. But so making sure you have some time as a board to discuss.
Yeah, Sophie, I've heard you make this statement that tech is the common denominator in every strategic business decision today. So Bert, what questions should the board be asking management when you're focusing on strategy? Is it about competitors? What do you think? Oh, I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I knew that was going to happen at least one time in this.
Of course, yeah.
That's a great example of disruptive technology.
Just like we rehearsed.
Yeah, that's exactly like we rehearsed. I would say one of the first things is the question you just asked. What's going on with our competitors? Is this technology or this disruptive wave, like the ripple conversation. Is this ripple going to enable our competitor to be more effective at competing against whatever business we're in? And not if, but how. What protections do we have against that change in technology and enablement that is given to our competitors? How do we compete against that? If we adopt a similar disruptive technology into our business and we in fact, for the lack of a better term, cannibalize our own business, will this catapult us forward and make us a better company longer term? Or do we just give up the turf and say this is a commoditized area, we don't really want to be there, we'd rather use our resources over here? I think those are very important questions, which means you have to do deep dive into your competitor. It's the intersection of understanding your competitor, understanding your competitor's strengths, and what this technology, whatever that disruptive technology might be, it's introduced. How does that change the chemical compound that makes them either more competitive or makes us more challenged? It's really leaning in there and asking those questions. Or on the other side is, okay, this disruptive technology is here. What does it enable us to do to challenge our competitor, to make them defend their turf in a way that heretofore they've not had to, because now we're enabled to be in that space in a way that we haven't. Some of the businesses that we're in are in the med tech area, and there are lots of innovation. That's an enormous amount of innovation going over there, particularly in the space of generative AI. Reading petri dishes and accelerating the amount of time, shortening the amount of time you can diagnose someone's infection has gone from 48 hours to 6 hours. That's hugely disruptive. And what allowed, and this is public, what allowed us to do is to compete in a very different way, to knock out some competitors, to change the way the space is looked at, and to actually enhance customer or patient outcome. Great example. We talked about that in the boardroom. We talked about that technology. We talked about how we could leverage it in a way. And we talked about competitors. It's just a relentless focus on doing that on a regular basis that's really required in the boardroom. And again, asking the unpleasant question. Does this change our business? How does it change our business? And not getting the soft answer, which is now they don't get it. We have the expert here. We're the experts here, and no one is going to be able to figure out what we do. Well, the last time that happened, people went out of business. I mean, every time that conversation, I'm sure Blockbuster had that conversation.
Great
and
points,
a couple additional risks, especially with generative AI, you need to look at is number one, what are the legal implications? For example, from an IP, intellectual property point of view, as you might be aware, the New York Times is suing OpenAI, claiming that OpenAI trained ChatGPT, their large language model, on some of the New York Times paid articles. It will be super interesting to see how that all turns out. But you, as a company, you can't just embed. You need to know what was everything trained on to make sure you don't violate any IP. But it's not only in AI, it's in CRISPR, it's an IP minefield. I mean, across the board, really understanding if these waves come, you can make sure that these waves are already protected by many patents, by many different players. So understand what it is and then go license as needed or invent around it as needed. That's important. And the second key one is to make sure, especially with generative AI, which is purely a representation of language, because these huge networks are trained on all of the human language. And so it just thinks about the next word and then the next word. It doesn't reason. It doesn't know what it's saying. It's not smart. And so making sure it doesn't start hallucinating. And so, because again, your brand would go down the tubes. And so that's where you can really, through prompt engineering and other capabilities today, and that's what all companies are doing, as I briefly touched on, you can make sure it's trusted, and you have to make sure it's trusted. So that's, again, questions. And you have to make sure the employees in the company don't use these open source models to ask questions that contain confidential information from your company, because then you train the models for your competitors to use. So there are many, many tricky things, but the right people in the company will understand what to do and keep it super secure, because in the end, your data is really what is going to give you a proprietary advantage, and making sure that your data stays with you within your firewalls and doesn't become part of training open AI models is very important.
Yeah, thank you. So
And Darren, one more thought here.
Sure.
I think it's important that when you ask about strategy and the board's role here, and I missed something I think is really critical. I think one of the things you have to always ask is, are we organized as a company in the way to deliver the greatest amount of value as the business changes? Because company structures oftentimes stay the same, even as the business changes. Do we need emphasis over in one area that we have not had a lot of resources, but now we need to meet those resources someplace else to either speed decision-making, change, or having the right resources in the right place? So I just felt it was important to make sure that that question often gets asked in the board.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you both. I just will take a quick moment to highlight some of these great questions. One of our directors, George, thank you. Some excellent points. I would encourage everyone to take a look at these. Some of the stuff that our panelists are talking about, challenging sort of core or convention, and asking these difficult questions and scenario kind of how could our product improve 5-10 times. I think these are all really good ones. Thank you, George, for pointing those out. But again, take a look at those comments. If we focus on risk now, I'd like to ask, what questions should the board be asking of management regards to risk? And Chris, would you start us off?
Sure. So let me just pick up where both Sophie and Bert left off here. And first of all, one of the first questions, which kind of sounds unusual, but I would, does risk have a seat at the strategy table? Yeah, I think that's one of those questions where, and I think it touches upon a couple of points, Darren, you just raised from George and others out there. But I think there are great, again, back to this issue of a lot of this technology is not new, it's just being applied differently. I think I'm going to use that same kind of takeaway as there's a lot of terrific management tools and capabilities. They just haven't been applied, I don't think, as effectively as they could be. Someone mentioned, I guess, scenario. For example, a risk at the seat table, a risk at the strategy table, the idea is, are we using scenario planning effectively? I know that sounds like, well, that's been around for a while. It has, but when I think about leading practice versus those who are maybe more conventional risk management, are we asking like enough of the what could go wrong? Let's play these things out. Let's take a look at it. Bert mentioned, asking those difficult questions around strategy, and I would do the same thing. It's not unusual for organizations to get very excited about a new product launch. To really, and that euphoria is a bias in a way about what is actually going to happen really well about this. But are we asking enough of the tough questions? And not to be doctors, no, that's not the role of risk at the table at all. And for those who I've chatted with about this, high performance racing, formula racing, and all that, this is the idea of how do we go harder, faster, but more safely. And I think that kind of mentality here, how do we interject being more thoughtful around risk at the strategy table? I think that is going to prove to be immensely productive and beneficial value creation wise and value protection wise. I think that's one of them. Sophie mentioned about, what is the cycle and the cadence on these conversations? I think the whole idea of tracking external risk of any type has to be in a continuous manner. I think that we have to move away from what got you here won't get you there. I think that this is just something that's a management and a leadership capability and a governance. It's not something you do once a year. It's not something that we touch upon. This has to be something that goes on, kind of continue. So is the management team really doing this on a continuous basis? The scenario planning, are we really doing the postmortems? I talked about failure early on here. I know it's a very uncomfortable discussion, but the idea that let's go back and do a postmortem on a new product launch. Or how are we doing there? What went well, what didn't go well? Where was the gap between expected and actual? And have we done an analysis on that? The same thing you could do proactively when you're going to do a new launch. Let's go through and do the scenarios to think about what could go wrong. I mean, these are again techniques and approaches that have been done in quality management for quite a number of years. Let's take that kind of discipline and capability and let's apply it to our strategy and risk. And you have folks internally that can do that. And just 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 like I think Crosby had the quality management is free, and around 1980 came out with this, that kind of everyone just opened their eyes and said, yeah, why aren't we doing quality differently? I think we're maybe at that time here too, where we could see this as a moment with this wave, which, by the way, let's not make it a tsunami, Sophie. I start with the waves. Bert talked about a ripple. I noticed that. You went back to a ripple versus the wave. What was a tsunami, right?
The ripple comes first and then the wave. And if you are not proactive, it'll become your tsunami,
Exactly. So I didn't say that, Sophie did. I just, I'm going to say. But the point, though, is that I think that these are the kind of things that we can do and all that. And then lastly, I think something I don't think I've mentioned yet, but all this opening the aperture to really think about, we got our operational risks, which I know we got to stay attended to. We've got these emerging risks. Now we have these strategic risks. So what are the risks to our strategy? What happened, whether it's proactively or retrospectively? But I think the other thing we need to do is, in that open aperture, is we need to do, I think, a more effective job, is what I'm hearing from some of the leading practices, on what we call, kind of I've seen as the vital few versus the trivial many. That 80-20 rule was about 5 years or so ago. The conference board had produced that study that talked about the majority of risk costs are in operational, financial, and other, and very little spent on strategic risk. Yet the greatest impact to corporate and shareholder value is what? Yes, like 80%. The idea is how can some of the questions to the management team, are we doing enough to sort of titrate down from, we have lots of risks. We've seen heat maps, all of us, that have an enormous number of risk on it. But is it really titrated down to, what are those % of risks that has the greatest potential?
I think, Chris, we're losing you, but that's okay.
Yeah, you're breaking up.
You're just bugged out. Hey,
yeah, sorry, I just had a few seconds there. Again, the 80-20 rule, the 20% for. Thank you. Sorry about that.
No worries. Thanks, Chris. I know we're getting near the end of our time together today, and there's some important things I want to get. I want to definitely have some time for the key takeaways, like 2 key takeaways from each of you for our directors today. But before we go into that, could you kind of quickly cover, given all the acceleration we're seeing around all these technologies, whether it be blockchain, quantum computing, how should a board be performing its oversight? And specifically, tell us what skills are needed. Sophie, and then Bert, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So before jumping onto board skills, I wanted to add one major risk, and it's also associated to skills. It's associated to employees. I mean, talent. A lot of these new technologies require people who know how to use them, number one. And number two, especially generative AI will make many jobs obsolete. In fact, IBM, for example, went as far as publicly saying they will no longer hire people in certain jobs that can be automated with AI, or just that AI can do those particular roles. So as board members, understanding, does the company have the talent required to be successful when these ripples become waves, right? So that is super important. And that's not only with natural language. I mean, these large language models, yes, they understand human language, but many other things, and they're just a representation of that language in this big network. So you can do the same with process signals, so in manufacturing lines, or with computer code. As we know, software engineers are really being helped with these kind of capabilities to write software much more effective and efficient. So it's really going to touch all jobs and all aspects. So do we have the talent? And so yes, on the board, many suggestions were already given by Bert, and Chris also is getting the board up to speed, having external speakers. It's cool if you have a techie on the board that's also broad, not only narrow, but having somebody that can constantly ask these questions. But in the end, all directors need to embrace and understand, especially something that's going to be the next electricity, like AI. So yeah, as a board, there are many things you can do, and most of them we have already touched on.
Yeah. Bert, what about you?
If you think about the 4 Yeah, if you think about the 4 SEC required committees, those are going to be there. You've got audit, you've got, all of the comp, et cetera. It's the question for me is, as your business evolves, as your company takes risk into a different direction or enhances risk in an area, do you have the other governance around that to make sure that you are fulfilling your fiduciary responsibility as a board? So do you need a quality committee? Do you need a technology committee? Some boards have an innovation committee or product committee, and all of that, it should be around. One is, what is the business trying to accomplish? What's the board's governance responsibility? How do you best execute against that? And what committees give you the best opportunity to do that? You can't have 40 committees, but what are the key ones in your business that allow you to make sure you're providing the best and appropriate governance oversight? And that may change over time.
Yeah, be nimble, right?
You have to be nimble, and you have to be, again, I thought George made 2 comments in the chat that I thought were quite good. One, you should never lose focus of your customers. So whatever you're trying to do should be valued by your customers so that you can retain or grow, et cetera. So that's one. As a board, you should never forget about your shareholders. So whatever you're doing, you've got to create value for those shareholders and customers. So that's our job, frankly, if you think about it.
Yeah.
And then third, can you govern the organization in the way that's critical by having the right structure?
Yeah. I think you both sort of point out things like really focusing management's attention on having assessment tools and metrics. I think you both kind of commented on, really important.
Right.
So as we come to a conclusion here, I'll ask you for some rapid fire takeaways. 2 takeaways. Put you on the hot seat, all of you. Sophie, what are your 2 key takeaways from today's discussions that we should take back to our respective boards?
You're muted. You're muted.
Okay, I'm unmuted now.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
I think the number 1 takeaway is that all these disruptive technologies are long in the making, so make sure you're on top of the ripples, and that will allow you to successfully serve the waves that are coming at you. I think that's the biggest one. There are many little ones specifically to AI, like make sure your data continues to be your data, it's where your IP is, and make sure you don't damage your brand and you really use it in a trusted and ethical way.
Yeah, Sophie, I imagine you're a sailor. I would have to think you're a sailor because you're really helping us focus on smooth sailing ahead. Chris, your rapid fire takeaways.
I think we've hit this quite a few times. Your number 1 is, again, I'm the eternal optimist. I like to be balanced on this. I think open your aperture around value. It's not all a downside here. And I like the fact that Bert brought up the customer, shareholder, where are the value, how, and by the way, this was mentioned earlier here. I mean, the entire reason a corporation was evolved way back to the beginning, way back when it was first, was to what? Take on risk, right? That's exactly why a corporation exists. So to have that very balanced approach would be number 1. And I think you've heard that throughout this conversation, that, there's a lot to be concerned about potentially. There's a lot of unknowns, and the speed and the pace, but there's an upside here too. So be balanced and all that. And the second thing would just be this whole notion of this risk intelligence that we talked about. It's an ongoing process, and whether it's these additional committees that Bert talked about, it's getting other experts in there, it's getting more voices and all that. Yes, yes, and yes. And so I guess I would just say, from the title of this discussion, the answer is yes. It's friend and foe potentially, but there's a lot more friend opportunity there too, with a lot to do.
I love your optimism, Chris. Thanks, Bert. If you wrap it up for us, tell us your wisdom.
Sure. I would just say I want to try to add something different than my colleagues who've added some very strong takeaways already. One is, I want to go back to something we talked about earlier, is maximize the strategic sessions with your management group. Make sure those are meaningful conversations, those are meaningful meetings, and challenge the status quo. Don't let today's solution be where you stay. Make sure that we're pushing the organization in a way strategically to maximize value. And again, as a board member, our primary responsibility is governance, and make sure that your governance structure supports all of the risk and all of the development that's going on in the organization, and that you're structured the way to provide that great oversight as a board. And again, ask those difficult questions in both of those realms, whether it's a strategy session or how the board operates it from a governance standpoint.
Yeah, I think that's great. Asking
Best I
those
can
hard
do.
questions. Yeah, very good, very good. And I think George is echoing that or leading us in that, asking those hard questions. You know, what would put us out of business, and really those existential questions. They are uncomfortable to ask, especially in good times, right? When we all wish for good times on our board, and know how hard everyone works for that. But those are really the times to do that. So George, thanks for those comments throughout it. Thanks to all of our directors today for the comments in the chat. You know, I just want to say, I'm going to turn over to Kathy, but Bert, Sophie, Chris, you know, really tremendous insights today. Really, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. It's been a pleasure for me to be the moderator today. And Kathy, I'll turn it over to you to wrap it up and take us home. Thank you.
Kathy, you're on mute now, I think.
Yeah, I know.
Okay.
Technology will get you, even simple things like that. This was an unbelievable conversation. As board members, all of us, I think, have been incredibly in our understanding of the risks and rewards facing us have been incredibly enhanced by this discussion. So I can't thank you enough. I have to say that one comment, maybe Sophie, maybe somebody else, to think about AI as electricity. The fundamental nature of AI going forward is as fundamental as electricity was, you know, 50, 75, 100, whatever years ago. Has the opportunity to change all of our lives in good ways and really have risks associated with it, as electricity did and does. And that we have to be on both sides of that equation, both the risk side and the reward side, as we sit on our board. So I can't thank you enough. I took extraordinary number of notes that I'm going to go back and review and maybe watch this video of this program again, because this was really helpful. Just a couple words about programs going forward. Our program calendar is scheduled through June, and we hope you're going to join us at one or more of our upcoming events. I want to highlight two of them. On April 11th, we're going to have an aspiring public company director program, which is designed for those of you who currently sit on large nonprofit boards or private corporate boards, and or our C-suite leaders who want to take the next step toward becoming a public company board member. Public company directors and industry experts will lead the discussions at this program. The second day-long program is on June 13th and will cover advanced topics for experienced public company directors, a chance for those of us on public companies to get together with a few colleagues and really sort through the issues, much like we did here in today's discussion. I also want to bring to your attention an upcoming program with a format that's new to us at NACD New England. We'll be hosting a case study discussion group led by Professor Suraj Srinivasan at the Harvard Business School, who's an expert on corporate boards. Look for that date on that, but expect an interactive and informative discussion and a lot of fun as we navigate issues that are challenging, like today's, even for our most experienced members. Please visit our website for a complete list of our upcoming events. Hopefully you'll be able to join us for one or more of these programs. And finally, please, please, please don't forget the survey. The link is in the chat and it will be in our follow-up email. So take a moment to fill it out now. We have a couple of minutes left, I think, in our program. Darren, do you want to follow up with anything that occurs to you?
No, I think we could give some people a little time back. Better early than late. You know?
2 minutes at 8:50 in the morning
Yeah,
are worth at least 10 minutes some other time. So
it's a
that's
little bonus for your great attention to all our directors. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for being on this Zoom presentation. Incredibly important topics. Thank you all. Thank the panelists in particular, Darren, Bert, Sophie, and Chris. Thanks so much.
Okay,
Thank you all.
bye-bye.
I assume you can. I'm Kathy Minahan. I'm the president